Hello, welcome to the Questioning Behaviour podcast. We are so pleased that you've chosen to tune in and listen. My name is Sarah Bowen, and every week I sit down with my co-host Merle van den Akker to discuss interesting topics relating to behavioural science.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that don't believe in science.
And on this episode, we are questioning the gap between academia and industry. Does it exist? Is it pervasive? Is it a problem? Merle, what do you think?
I love how we're approaching this as if we know so much about both academia and industry. I would like to reiterate, Sarah and I are both PhD students. We don't have any work experience beyond academia, so we qualify as academics completely. And yeah, so all the experience that we have with this industry or academia gap is that we know one side of the story from the academic perspective, which is, it's something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think we can at least speak to whether there are collaborations that are going on between industry and academia, but also beyond that about sort of perceptions of practitioners of behavioural science that are not within sort of these closed academic circles, so to speak.
Sure. That's fair.
Yeah.
I mean, I know for your PhD that you collaborate with an industry partner for your research anyway, don't you?
Yes, that's true. So I'm collaborating with an industry partner in the sense that we are collaborating to design a randomized controlled trial to test an intervention that could be used within an existing service that they already provide. The idea is that this industry partner can provide us access to a sample, a very specialized sample, and that they can also provide expertise in this case, it would be the provision of advice you would give to patients starting a new medication. I mean, what I would say about this collaboration is that it hasn't been me going into the stores on the ground and doing sort of proper field work and, actually collaborating with people who are not academically minded. In fact, I would say it's almost the opposite. I'm dealing with people who operate within the business, but who also are very established within academia. So these are the type of people who we'll discuss this later in the episode, but these are the type of people that we might call hybrids. So it leads me to think about, what is the nature and the definition of collaboration between academia and industry, and also what are the roles of, people who have a strong grounding in both industries. And in my case, I very much had the experience that hybrids are excellent at facilitating research and communicating between researchers and people who run and live and work within business, providing a service, and be able to translate what's going to work from an academic perspective, what's interesting from an academic perspective, to what is feasible and also relevant, importantly, to people working within the business.
Yeah, I suppose then my projects don't really tie in that much with industry either. My projects are industry based to the extent that the data is from companies that don't describe themselves as academic. The type of companies I collaborate with are the type of companies that collect transactional data. So this is apps or the financial banking system. But then I suppose if you're looking at a decent collaboration between industry and academia, no, I don't think this qualifies either, because I'm not going in there to meet the team, and we don't have discussions about how we would set up the research or what we're looking into, how we're approaching the questions that we're asking. Where effectively we ask them for the data, they either deliver the data or they don't. We sign up NDA agreements and then we have to then argue what can and what can't be published with regards to mentioning their name, because it might affect the company. And yeah, so we're giving each other something. They're giving us data. We're giving them insights. Do they even want these insights? I'm not entirely sure. Are they beneficial beyond academia? Potentially, but for the partner that we're working with, questionable. It's a bit odd like that.
From an academic perspective, that's what we expect as a collaboration. We use industry as a gateway to get new data and to ask questions that we think are interesting. But, we have to have some idea of how this research is going to impact people outside of academia. Like, that's tied in with every bid for funding that you'll probably ever apply to. But that's never really the focus of the research. It's not even necessarily it's not even considered necessarily as important. Is that a controversial thing to say? It's not really considered as important as how interesting the research question is to academics.
I don't think that's controversial. I think that's accurate. I think a lot of with this... I get where you're going. I do think there's a lot of academics or just a lot of professionals in general who do care very deeply about the type of impact that it can make. But it has to be mentioned that if people are really focused on impact, they do very different types of research than someone who is just interested in something for the sake of being interested in it. I think behavioral science, or behavioral economics, if you will, is quite... A lot of the field is quite impact focused because it's so heavily related to policy. And, you can't just, come up with policies and test policies for the sake of, it might be fun to test this policy. That's not really how that works. So I do think that the field is quite impact oriented with regards to that. But a lot of the stuff is also where you're just like, they've written a paragraph on, how this result or how they're set up or how their recommendations, should hold up in the real world and can make impact. And then you're reading that and you're like, I think this paragraph was just an afterthought to make it easier to sell your research.
And I would say, I think a lot of this thinking about how is this question or this research question or this result, how is it interesting outside of academia? A lot of the work I see is really into just trying to motivate the study. So often you'll see studies which are quite abstract, either like experimental lab studies, where at first glance it's not very clear what sort of real life situation this sort of decision environment is mimicking. And a lot of then the work on how is it valid outside of the lab is sort of through this impact lens. But it's really just, I guess, an exercise in sort of building a narrative story to convey something that's easy to read and easy to follow, and that there's a point to it all. I mean, I think then that the role of practitioners is incredibly important because they are sort of dedicated to doing what academics won't do by themselves, which is actually collaborate with industry partners in a way that it's a collaboration right from the beginning of sort of figuring out, okay, so what within the industry is working? What do we think that we can improve upon? What are sort of interesting questions you've come across yourselves, and sort of empowering people within industry to think about things through a sort of more analytical lens, through a sort of more research-focused lens, and ask research-type questions. So, I think the role of practitioners is incredibly important, but I don't think that they are perceived very well within academia. I don't know. What would you say, Merle, to this?
I find it difficult to estimate what the general academic perception is of practitioners. Because there have been so many shifts in academia lately, where, of course, if you did a PhD 20 years ago, you were going to go into academia, whereas now within our respective cohorts, I know a lot of people who entered the PhD to get a stronger foundation or a stronger background or skill set within an academic sense, because academia does represent scientific rigor often. I'm not saying it always does, but it's often perceived as such. And that the completion of the PhD degree would then make them more competitive or more able to compete within industry itself, because they would be backed by scientific rigor. And this is something I think was a lot less present 20 years ago or even further down the line. I think now a lot of people within the PhD programs are actively, they're going into the PhD without even thinking that they're going to be an academic, and they're orienting towards industry from the get-go. And I think that is going to make a very big difference between academia and industry, and the perceptions that either field has of each other. Because of course someone in the PhD knows about academia but then decides to leave it and goes into industry, meaning that I think a lot of the perceptions that the fields have of each other will become increasingly closer to reality, whatever reality might be. But I suppose this is something, this is something that it's gonna take a long while as well, but I think we are moving towards that. At least I hope so.
And I think it should be mentioned that 20 years ago we didn't have nudge on the scene, which sort of has made behavioural science popular and has sort of created a demand in the private sector for behavioural science insights. So for this kind of research and this kind of practitioning. So I think it's this idea that actually now academia has a competitor for PhD students, right? It has this sort of now, before sort of the only real option to stay as a researcher and sort of stay in this line of work was to stay and operate within universities. Now there's opportunities to join consultancy firms or think tanks or sort of government bodies. There are lots more options for people with a sort of a researcher practitioner skill set than there were before.
Yeah, no, absolutely true. This is one of the changes that is massively contributing to how people approach doing a PhD in behavioral economics or behavioral science. Which is a fair argument, but like you said, the field is young, both in academia and in industry. So there are still some kinks and some flaws that need to be worked out, or some things that aren't going as smoothly as they could go, including the transition between academia and industry, or the collaboration between the two of them. I think we should move on from this ourselves and actually call in our expert. So we've got one hell of an expert today. So she is the CEO of BEWorks. So I am talking about Kelly Peters. She co-founded the company BEWorks together with Nina Mazar, who is predominantly an academic, and Dan Ariely, who is also predominantly an academic. So I think she should be able to give us the insights when it comes to closing the gap between academia and industry. I think she's the ultimate person to talk about that.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, welcome to the show, Kelly. So today we're actually talking to Kelly Peters. Kelly, it is quite common on this podcast that we don't do the introducing, but our guests actually do the introducing. So tell the audience, who are you?
My name is Kelly Peters, and I'm the CEO and co-founder of BEWorks. That's the short, brief description of who I am. I'm a person who's very passionate about behavioral science. I'm a person who is very committed to the application of this field in the real world, and that uncovers so many things about who I am and I think maybe what I stand for, which is around making kind of tearing down the walls between academia and the so-called real world, because I'm interested in scientific thinking being something that everyone has access to and participates in. So being a champion for scientific thinking is probably a more apropos way of describing who I am. And then the thing that follows that would be around the behavioral insights aspect of behavioral science. And that is helping all of us to become more reflective of who we are and who we want to be and who our members of society are, and how we want to strengthen the connections between us so that we can achieve a better world. So then this second part of who I am is helping us to understand that we can go much deeper than our intuition in terms of understanding how we make decisions and how we behave. And that way you don't need to start from ground zero every time we've got a question. In fact, there's been so much research that's already done. And instead of just our colloquial, casual conversations, there's a whole world of scholarship that's already been done that can help advance our conversations. Again, to help us know more about what we already know, about how we think and how we behave. Again, to help us achieve a better world. So I guess then the second element of who I am is an optimist, a visionary, maybe someone who's watched too much Star Trek and utopian fiction, wanting to achieve a world where we're all, listening to music and playing art and making things and living in a peaceful, productive, wonderful society. So I guess
nothing wrong with being an idealist.
Yes.
We need some of those these days, I think.
Yes, I think we can use a couple of proper idealist ground in behavioral science. So then actually comes the question: how did you roll into behavioral science?
Yeah, I guess it's this kind of complicated web. I think one of the things that's so fascinating when we think about how did we get here. A part of how we think about that story is sometimes it's everything sort of fits into place, and there's this kind of nice linear path where we can connect the dots, but we leave aside a whole lot of other dots and a whole lot of other threads. So if I just pick up one of those threads, it probably starts with just being really curious about the impact of these gadgets that my mom bought when I was young. Kind of things changed in my house. My mom bought a VCR when I was a kid, and I was the one who was tasked with getting this big black box kind of plugged in and set up and hooked up to the TV. And then I was the one who sort of had this job of being the projectionist. I'd put in the tapes, and my mom was this huge movie buff, and she loved these kind of 1950s, 1960s, black and white, James Dean type movies. And my parents had one of these giant TVs with the three, the red, green, yellow kind of bulbs that protruded out and projected these movies on the screen. And my father played his part in converting the garage into this movie theater, and just all these pieces kept coming into place. We got a popcorn machine, we got a big sectional couch, and everything was centered around this machine. And our social lives changed. My mom had movie nights. My parents used to host movie nights for my friends. We have sleepovers in front of this TV screen, and the tapes would play. And that was the first time where I really was just so fascinated by how a piece of technology, literally a black box piece of technology, can transform the way we live. And so that led me to thinking about technology and its impact on society. So when I went to university, I studied a mix of things. I did study philosophy and literary theory and contemporary art theory and economics. Anywhere I could get my hands on theory and sort of understanding the why of things is what I was after. And in particular, I was very curious about technology, its impact on society. So that's kind of my starting point. When I went to university at Florida State, I'm American and Canadian. I actually didn't get a degree. I, at the time, thought that it was a waste of intellectual curiosity to pigeonhole us into these shrink-wrapped, artificially distinguished fields of inquiry. And my parents didn't necessarily support my
Agree.
choice, but they didn't impede it either, which is nice. And it let me take the time to just ask the questions that I was curious about and take the courses that I was interested in. And that I think is what kind of is the earliest kind of connection point between what I was doing when I was young and what I'm doing now, which is I'm still just curious about society. And, I spent a lot of years working on technology. I worked in dot-com startups. I started doing internet consulting in 1993. That tells you about my age. And got into the banking sector, looking at technology and, again, driving adoption and understanding how we can model consumer behavior as a way to assess risk for credit risk models. And that led to trying to understand the fields of risk management and risk theory so that we could then have those insights, build them into our models, drive innovation on the basis of what we know about human behavior and what's realistic and what kinds of behaviors are more difficult to change. So that was me through the 90s and the 2000s. And there's already so much there when it comes to empirical views on understanding people's perception of risk and looking at their attitudes towards technology, looking at how people make decisions, when it comes to banking products. There's already so much there back in the 90s and 2000s. So one of the things, though, that just was this huge aha moment for me was the way behavioral economics, as it's been called, the way it pulled together three things for me was just this transformation in, like, this is what I have to do. I have to shift from being an industry to just be dedicated to the development and refinement of this kind of very basic framework that just really kind of knocked my legs out from underneath me. And that was behavioral economics had three things that it was playing with. One was, it's great to have these insights about how people make decisions. It's great to understand now things like bounded rationality and our, limits on our rationality and what those limits are. And that really changes our understanding of how people engage in markets and so on. So all of this wonderful psychology was just powerful and took everything that I knew in the business world in terms of its limits and just really threw those limits up against the wall and made it so transparent, like relying on surveys, relying on observation, relying on management, intuition, and experience is just profoundly inadequate. So that's great. I've got that from the years of the reading and the application of those behavioral insights. But the second part, though, of behavioral economics, the radical part, the activist part, the part that appeals to my desire to make the world a better place, came to life through nudge. When there was a label for an action around how do we actually help people bridge the gap between what they say and what they actually do, help me to start to put together this field as now not only a really cool way to mine around and look for insights about how people make decisions, but now actually a platform to drive social change. And then last but not least, it's the models and it's the experimentation that provide us with the justification that we need sometimes to try things that are very counterintuitive. And so it was through experimentation that I was able to unlock ideas that were counterintuitive to the business and unlock innovation. And so the most radical tool that we have is experimentation. So it was those three things that came together for me through Nudge, through Dan's work, and then through others, that I realized that there was this kind of a complete package. And what I wanted to do is now build a framework that could make this application and development of science very, very practical, for others to be able to follow. Because in absence of that, people don't know how to develop and apply the scientific method. They don't know how to come up with interesting questions about behavior. Mm-hmm. They don't have different strategies and techniques to impact it, influence it. And certainly they don't have a good grounding in the mechanics of the practice of science. So that was back in 2007, 8, 9, where I had this kind of epiphany and had organizational support to build a behavioral economics team and to start to work with some really awesome people in the behavioral economics field to start running experiments. I met Nina Mazar, I met Dilip Soman, I met Senthil Mullainathan.
To just casually mention some names.
and of course I met Dan Ariely, and so this was back in 2008, 2009, and started to run experiments, and that was that kind of defining moment for me, that this is what I want to do.
Fair enough. I mean, that's quite that's one hell of a story, actually. Yeah. So I'm quite curious, and is it specifically your idealism that has driven you to co-found and become the CEO of BEWorks?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think so. I think, if I go back to my university days, I was definitely the activist type, and I was rallying for the environment or rallying for this, that, and the other thing. And then I had a quiet period. And that quiet period was when I went deeper into studying economics and really wanted to understand, how the system works in a very practical way as well. What are the barriers to this idealized society? And that's when I started to read the market-oriented economist. So it was everything from Ludwig von Mises to Joseph Schumpeter and everything in between, to have a balanced understanding of the role of markets in driving society, and that helped me to understand the complexity of it all. And it's not just a matter of differences in values, but the mechanics of economics are incredibly complex, and aligning those incentives is very difficult to do. But if we're ever to reach an idealized society, then we need to understand what the barriers are to standard economic theory. Yeah. Standard economic theory is actually this idea of this pure world where we have market actors who are rational, operating through transparency, through fair market exchange, distribution of goods and services at a price point that we all value. So the signals are clear, there's honesty, integrity, access to the system. And so then what are the barriers to that idealized world of a free-flowing economic system that doesn't have to depend on regulation, that doesn't have to depend on law, so that actors are, compliant with reasonable moral standards. So that was a journey that I went on for a while, where my activism was limited to maybe the shaping and evolution of my own thinking. Mm. And then it's continued now. I think through BEWorks, I've had the opportunity to create a company with a mandate to transform society and the economy through scientific thinking. And part of my activism just stops right there. More scientific thinking equals better world. But there is more than that, which is to helping define what is that greater good. And there's so much wonderful work that I'm able to be inspired by, and that's all the work that's been done around purpose-driven companies, around companies and nonprofit groups like Just Capital, that are revisiting the ideals of a healthy capitalist society, but are confronting very head-on the limits and the problems and trying to find solutions for them, where we are actively ensuring that we're uncovering what the issues are around employee well-being, that we're accountable for the impact on environment, that we're transparent about being fair and honest in our dealings with our customers. It's about having accountability to the communities in which we operate. These are the elements that organizations like Just Capital are now starting to help explore and improve. And what I love is there's been this evolution from the work in the 1990s around corporate social responsibility, and a lot of companies took on this, in response to activists holding them to account for violations in human rights, at the extreme end to unfairness and inequality, at the lightest end, in terms of how they were, manufacturing their products or distributing their products. But the thing is, corporate social responsibility, in some ways it had such powerful impact. But then in my experience, some of it was, even though some of the impacts lasting, but in my point of view, some of it got marginalized, and it became underfunded corporate legal teams, sometimes, doing the very best they can, but actually having accountability to things like corporate communications. And so instead of this actually being transformational, not just to the company and every single individual working in that company, but transformational in terms of its role in society. So then that set of activities became, I would say, marginalized. And I think that we're now we have an opportunity for a renaissance that could be led in part by the thinking that we're doing in behavioral science. And that's having transparency around behavioral measures that we didn't have before. See, corporate social responsibility was more limited by measures such as, we're able to put this in our annual report. These are the activities that we're taking. And the primary stakeholder in all of this is the investor. But now we live in a world where we can have much better transparency around a whole other set of measures of behavior. Tremendous accountability now can follow from that. So do I see myself as an activist? Yes, I think
yes is a very fair answer. Oh, damn. No, I find it interesting. I feel like listening to you, I feel like I want to be more of an activist. So you can definitely sell the cause. This is good. This is really good.
I think something that strikes me, Kelly, about your story of how you got into behavioural science was just this natural curiosity that you seem to have to try and get to the bottom of human behaviours, why we make decisions, and questions actually that you could think of as quite academically minded, quite philosophical questions. So what was it like to try and address these questions within an industry setting before the likes of Nudge came along that provided, transferable and communicated these types of frameworks that could be used in a non-academic setting?
Yeah, there's lots of things that your question makes me think about. One of them, so definitely curiosity is something that I'm so passionate about, and I don't think that we give ourselves enough time and space to be curious about why things are the way they are. Whether we're standing in line at the grocery store and the line seems really slow, and trying to understand, like, why is it like that? Or taking the time to just dream and be curious and imagine fantastical worlds that don't exist today. And so that's definitely one thing that is very important to me. But a couple other things that you said are I think very important to respond to, and that's around questions asked in academics. I actually think that I kind of am moving into subscribing to the business world generally has and kind of a lot of folks in the real world. When you say the word academic, it's actually a bad word. It's an insult to call someone. So to be called academic is actually pejorative.
Okay, no offense intended. I'm sorry, Kelly.
Yeah. No. But that's what I want to change. I want to change that. I want to help academics not be seen as elitist and out of touch. And I want to help the real world engage in some of the systematic discipline of what it means to be an academic. So if we leave the word aside for a moment, and what are we actually talking about? Well, an academic is someone engaged in the professional pursuit of understanding knowledge and of adding to that knowledge and of sharing that knowledge.
Well, sharing that knowledge, given that most academics publish in academic journals, which with very, very pricey subscriptions, questionable.
There's all kinds of weaknesses or opportunities within the system, but that's the general practice, and it's the publication, it's the job of teaching. So those are in its idealized version, that is the job of being an academic is to have accountability, to learn knowledge, add to knowledge, challenge existing knowledge, and then disseminate that knowledge. Mm-hmm. Well, and then there's standards around quality of peer review. There's standards around how that knowledge gets shared, how that knowledge gets created. There's standards around those things. And those standards, in an idealized version, are very good. They're important so that knowledge can be parsed out from opinion, and so that it's knowledge that can be trusted. And so if we think that those things are legitimate human activities, then why must it be left within academia? And the questions then are all around us. So academia should be interested in the questions that are relevant outside of the campus, interested in questions that are happening to us in society as individuals. And so that boundary then between people engaged in the pursuit of knowledge is now just a matter of degree and type. And so then academics should be something where it's like, I get to do this full time. Mm-hmm. But then again, there's lots of people who we want to be engaged in adding to, enhancing, and challenging and sharing knowledge all of the time. So I don't know if that answers some of the questions that you had.
No, I think it does. I think it poses even more interesting questions about, the separations between the academic and the non-academic world, and the arbitrariness of them in some cases, and also whose responsibility it is to bridge that gap. Is it, I'm guessing the answer would be that it's a two-way street.
I think it's both. There are some simple answers, and it's a work in progress. And your premise of it being a two-way street and the obligations it's on, within both parties, if we can create it so binary, is I think a sound premise. So in terms of what the business world ought to be doing, first of all, the fundamentals of what scientific thinking are not embraced within the business world, and there's so much teaching to do, and I feel like a lot of what my job is actually, teaching scientific thinking and helping add clarity to individual leaders, but also just organizational structures. How are they structured that inhibits or enables good quality thinking? And I'm very passionate about changing the structure of organizations and how they make decisions in a way that actually harnesses the best practices of academia. And that's language that I use. I talk about harnessing the best practices of academia. And some of the recommendations I have are very, very pragmatic. They're things like, let's establish what our key measures are, and challenge what those key measures are. Make sure they're reliable and valid, because there are a lot of so-called solutions in the market that appeal to business leaders because of their simplicity, but they're actually not reliable or sound measures. And there's lots of one-shot, how loyal are your customers type measures that actually don't hold up to scientific scrutiny. So making sure that organizations even just understand what high quality measures are, doing things like, if we now have these variables of interest that we've agreed upon, then how can we have things like allow teams to be curious about what might affect positive change on those measures of interest? And so allowing for budgets and support for employees to be able to run their own experiments throughout the course of the year. So little research and development budgets that allow people to test their hypothesis about maybe surprise and delight might have a very positive impact on loyalty, and allowing employees to start to have that kind of curiosity about the big questions. And then allowing and encouraging employees to write up, what was their experiment? What measures did they use? What methods did they use? Where's the data? And make that available for other employees to now build upon, to debate, to explore, enhance what that experiment was. And so now if employees are writing up these experiments that they're running so that other employees can review them, starts to sound like a journal, starts to sound like peer review.
Sure.
And starts to sound like having research grants and budgets and repositories for where data is stored. Starts to sound like open science. And then allowing employees to meet, to have conferences, to present their papers, to present their research, to have the opportunity to have interpersonal conversations, and to start to bring in some of the beautiful characteristics of science around things like, the way that science is presented is with humility, is with, these are the limitations, these are what we included and excluded, and the methods that we use might be flawed, so here they are, please review, please use your objective evaluation of this. I'm open to that feedback. Those dynamics are very different than typical business behavior that people are trained in and evaluated on.
I think you have a quite an idealized version of the world of science and academia. Not to be rude or dismissive, but given what I've seen in real life, it's a good ideal to aim for. But the humility and the objectivity that you've mentioned sometimes are very well hidden, to say the least.
Yes, it's definitely, these are the best practices of what science should definitely hold itself to. But just because that there's shortcomings in that doesn't mean there isn't a good model for the business world to look at in terms of best practices
That's a very fair point.
Yeah. It sounds as though, if I've understood this right, what you're suggesting is trying to add to the list of goals that businesses might be structured around this idea of knowledge generation, and having businesses generate knowledge, within their industries, within their own firms, and building on top of each other and learning based on these sort of best practices from academia. It sounds absolutely fascinating. Have you seen any sort of examples of adoption of this epistemology in your experience, or is this something that is to aim for, an ideal?
Yeah, it's a very important question, and I would say that we're very much at the earliest of stages of that, and I'm trying to play a small part in that through BEWorks, through the BEWorks Academy, through my book, which are all about empowering people to, first of all, have the fundamentals of scientific thinking. And then they're rewarded, once you unlock the principles of scientific thinking, they're rewarded with the quirks and nudges and all of the really fun, counterintuitive insights of behavioral science. So once you have that foundation of scientific thinking, then we can move on to looking at what we've learned so far and what mistakes we've made so far around the science of decision making and the science of behavioral change. So we're very early on because there are still so few people who think about the world in this way. And one of the unfortunate challenges that I struggle with is I've been doing this behavioral science, the practice of it, for over 12 years now. And generally, I've found that there's an unfortunate barrier between academia and practitioners like myself. There is a very unhealthy elitism that is, I think, a grave disservice and a misrepresentation and a misunderstanding of the ideals of many practitioners, which is unfortunate. Now, many practitioners do not understand or appreciate the standards by which I hold my team accountable for. And they use techniques that are very, very shoddy. It's not necessarily intentional, though. It's, again, because the process and execution of science is really hard. And that knowledge is very, very difficult. And so there's a lot of work to do, and elitism doesn't serve anyone well. And neither does not caring about method serve anyone well.
That's a fair argument.
So there's a lot of work to do. There's a lot of work to do to see this change in organizations, be they companies and small businesses, covering the commercial side. There's a lot of work to do in nonprofits and philanthropic institutions in terms of using evidence-based approaches. And there's a lot of work to do in governments, a lot of work to do in academia, and a lot of work to do just amongst the everyday Joe using Facebook and engaged in the consumption and dissemination of information.
I'm actually quite curious. So you've initially already mentioned that academia is quite elitist. Now, I was initially like, no, we're super approachable old socks that are maybe a couple of decades behind on the time. What exactly is it about academia or academics, if you want to get nice and personal, that you find so elitist or so unapproachable? It's
the ongoing insults from academics about practitioner work, and the snubbing and the exclusion. So let's look at some organizations. I love what BSPA is doing, but how many people? I'm not represented, for instance, on that body. Where are people like me in helping shape the agenda of some of these organizations? And it's a gap. It's a gap, and I definitely don't want to convey too much sour milk, because it's less about me and as much about what I hear from others, and I'm trying to channel that. But I've had a fair number of people who, the people who are on my team, their academic advisors come to my office and ask me, why and how I've stolen so many of the top students from, let's say, University of Toronto's psychology department or at Waterloo.
I can come up with some reasons personally.
Yes, it was easy for me to come up with the reasons as well. But there's definitely, and each of them have been asked, how on earth could you possibly go to industry? So they've been asked that many, many times.
That's a serious disconnect. I don't know why I find this so foreign. Maybe it's but then Toronto also has a business school, so I'm really confused. Because Sarah's with an economics department. I'm within a business school myself. You should argue that those departments should be very, at least relatively industry focused. So I'm actually really, really surprised about this, because if we had an industry partner, because we just call them partners, come to us for a collaboration, I just can't imagine someone snubbing you. I just really can't imagine.
I should clarify. Well, definitely that exists within the business world, but I should clarify. Most of our team is hired from, almost 100% are hired from one of the disciplines within psychology.
Sure. So psychology is the issue. Edit this out. I don't need beef with psychology. I don't need it. No, I find it peculiar. No, it just aligns with a couple of conversations I've had both online and in real life, that there seems to be, to me, behavioral science and behavioral economics has a lot of grounding or overlap with psychology. But when it comes to this type of business approach, there seems to be a massive difference, or at least a difference in how people interpret either of the fields, which I find very interesting, very strange.
It is. It's and I think strides are being made. I mean, that's exactly why BSPA was set up. That's why we have our annual summit. That's why different journals are being produced to help bridge this silly gap. It's that said, it's very complicated, because I very much cherish the ideals of science, as has, I think, I hope has come through, and many academics cherish those ideals as well, and have, I think, a reasonable level of anxiety about practitioners that are unaware of or don't care about the discipline that's required and the rigor that's required to meet those ideals. And so, as much as I say that there's elitism, in part it's justified, and we just need to do a better job of making sure that it isn't stereotyping. Sure. And that's the irony, is that I think that there's some stereotyping, but what are those standards? What are those ideals? How do we help everyone to be accountable to those standards within academia, within the quality of the research that's done there, and with the quality of research that's done in the real world? We actually have the potential to improve the nature of thinking and to improve the quality of knowledge and the processes that are used if we work collaboratively.
Is that the ideal, ultimately?
Yeah.
That would be the ideal.
Oh, absolutely fascinating. I think I need to do some introspection about why I have this strong binary of academic versus non-academic worlds, and that they exist in very separate Venn diagrams. But yeah, I'm very glad that we've got someone like you, Kelly, who's such an idealist, to sort of lead the
Yeah.
charge for change, because I think it's a very important endeavour.
Wonderful.
Fight a good fight. I'm in support. I will be your loyal soldier.
Well, I think that you have been doing such wonderful work as well, and I'm a fan and very much support the time and energy that you have put into building a strong community and sharing the knowledge. I'm just very proud of the work that you're doing and encourage you to stay strong and because you're representing my ideals by doing what you're doing, which is being curious, gathering that knowledge, and sharing it.
Kelly, you're making me blush.
Yeah.
So thanks so much for your time today.
Yeah, and thanks so much for your time. It's been wonderful. And Kelly, if the listener wants to sort of hear more from you or keep up to date with what you're doing, both yourself and at BEWorks, where can we find you online?
Well, I've got we've got the usual channels, and we've got our Twitter account for BEWorks, and then I've got my Twitter account, which is Kelly BEWorks. Those are a couple of the places, and then our LinkedIn has some of the information, and we're very committed to telling our story this year with more publications, more blogs, and things like that. So we'll have some content to be able to share throughout the year. So I'd love for some of your audience to take a look.
I'm sure they will.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, thank you for that amazing talk, Kelly. I think there's a lot to unwrap here. Sarah, why don't you start us off? What is the main thing that you learned today?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things I think stood out from our discussion. So I really liked this idea of rather than sticking with this binary of you're either an academic or you're a non-academic, or if you're stood on the other side, you're either a practitioner or you're not a practitioner or an industry. We have these hybrids, and trying to think about the world not as this strict binary, which I think suits to keep those walls up and sort of to keep academia and non-academia very insular. It's sort of this idea of, you could have a foot in both worlds and sort of be a hybrid. And, there are different degrees of hybridity. So what I'm saying is it's a spectrum.
Isn't it always a spectrum in behavioral science? I'm not entirely sure if it actually serves academics at all. I mean, Kelly has just, because Sarah and I currently qualify as academics, Kelly has put us in our place. We are out of touch. We're elitist. Apparently, we snub practitioners. I would like to add, I feel personally offended. I have never snubbed no one, and neither has Sarah. But yeah, no, but without, all jokes aside, I do understand where the stereotype comes from. I've met plenty of academics who are pretty full of themselves. To put it lightly. And I can imagine that if someone reaches out to them who isn't already of professor status, that they might not be as professional or as just filled with human decency as they could be. But no, I think I remember going to the Behavioral Exchange Summit, which you have also attended in London in 2019.
Yeah, that's the one.
Yeah. I thought it was 2018 already, but that's time, and time is a social construct anyway. Anyway, we've been to the most recent Behavioral Exchange, and I remember there being a talk, and someone, what it wasn't a panel, and someone already indicated there that academia and industry would continue to merge anyway, and then these boundaries would fade out. And at the time, I was like, cool idea, but we've got a long way to go. But what I see from the academic side is that we set up a lot more collaborations with industry partners to, in some cases, just to access data, but sometimes also to actually properly collaborate. Although the former is more common, I suppose. And I suppose from a practitioner side, to have academic rigor within your work is also quite advantageous, and to have it published on both an industry and an academic level, does indicate or does signal value. So I do suppose that this unification, or just the abolishment of this binary system, is closer than we think. At least I hope so. Well, that was the end of my monologue.
No, also very idealistic, as Kelly is herself. I think there's something to say about sort of the attitudes of academics towards people who are non-academics. I think when it comes to looking at people in industry, so potential research partners and collaborations, I think there's a difference between, a business reaching out and saying, hey, I'd really like to do some work with you. I think I have all of this data that you could potentially use. Let's do something together. That's an opportunity that any academic would jump on, right? That's sort of saying, okay, well, I'm going to be able to use this collaboration or use this access to get data and, answer my own research questions and publish well. But I think there's a difference between actually using people in industry and collaborating with people in industry. So, working together to, actually stop and ask people in industry, what are the questions that you think are interesting and that you would like to see addressed, within your own firm, and wider, rather than sort of having it just be what academics think is interesting. Because even though, yes, that is interesting and that can lead to impact, the impact agenda is all over the place now. You have to sort of prove anything that you're doing is going to have a wider impact than just academia. But most of the time that's just sort of cheap talk. That's just fill in the impact section in your bid, make it sound really good, and hopefully people believe it, right? So, and
at the end of the paper you write like a paragraph on policy implications, and you hope you're not completely talking out of your ass. Yeah, no, I have written a paragraph like that. I am so sorry.
we all have, because that's sort of the game that is set up, right? You have to jump through the hoops to get the funding to do the research that you want to do,
and then hopefully get a publication, which is just another hoop. No, I find it so interesting because you just mentioned that keeping this binary system up is actually quite advantageous to academics. I don't think it is. Kelly already mentioned earlier that she is actually within BEWorks, so her company. She actually doesn't find it very difficult to recruit PhD students. And if you look at what a PhD originally is, a PhD is a way of getting into academic jobs, into the academic sector. And it is very controversial still what the value of a PhD is beyond academia. A lot of employers don't really know how to value it. I don't really know what it is, but of course, this also depends per company, per sector. But I find it quite interesting. So she has, her work, her company is predominantly research oriented. So I suppose having a PhD, there's an argument to be made for its value. But if a program or a form of education, which is technically speaking what the PhD is, which is originally targeted towards becoming or creating people to become academics, I don't think that's a proper English sentence, but whatever, and it is still doing that, but yet the academic environment is so unappealing that these people prefer to move into business. I think academia needs to take like a real good look in the mirror, because if it is not attractive to PhD students who tend to be very, very clever, very hardworking people, I'm just patting myself on the back here. Yeah, let's be honest here. But if you continuously lose out on those people, and if they move into industry, then probably you as academia don't have that much to offer, or at least you have a lot less to offer than you think you do.
No, I think the academic world is incredibly toxic and can be incredibly toxic, and just a not a great place to work sometimes, or a lot of the times. And it does, obviously, we've talked about this in our first episode, but there are lots of factors that are going to affect your experience, in the PhD and then going on further into academic life. But the thing is that's particularly toxic is that I think that, academia as a whole won't think that they're a problem.
Oh no,
they're not the
it's not
problem.
them.
No, yeah,
It's you.
it's exactly right. It's these PhD students who are not cut out for this environment, or it's
Yeah.
these PhD students who haven't been able to publish and they haven't been able to get an academic job. And so obviously they've then been forced to become a practitioner. Like that is the sort of underlying sort of messaging that we're sort of given, that, if you're not qualified enough to become an academic, okay, well then you go into teaching. And then if you're not qualified, or you don't get employed as a teacher at universities, you have to leave academia. And it's sort of seen there's like sort of a clear hierarchy of jobs,
which is really, really odd. Yeah, it's for when it comes to the funding scheme. So within universities, there's a lot of different ways of being employed at the university. You can be a teaching fellow, a research fellow. One is often considered better than the other, but then they're all not as great as being an actual employed postdoc. But then there's also the thing that you probably shouldn't be a postdoc at the university that you did your PhD, because that means you're not competitive enough when it comes to applying to other universities, and that you're just being held on to as a form of pity, or whatever. And it's everyone knows these stereotypes, everyone knows these value judgments, and I think they're bullshit.
Yeah, and the subtext, it's so ingrained that even after 1 year in a PhD, you sort of pick up on this idea. There's like a clear hierarchy, and if whatever I do, it's going to send a signal to my colleagues and people in other institutions and future employers of why I've got this job. Like, yeah, it's crazy.
It's the weirdest thing. Like, if I want to continue, so I am at the risk of, when I finish my PhD, because I do want to I want to do predominantly the academic track. I'll figure out how to become a hybrid later, but I'll be predominantly academic for at least a while. So I'm gonna do a postdoc. Within the postdoc, I need to first make sure that I'm not at Warwick, because I've been at Warwick for 2 masters and a PhD, so that's too long already. And then I also need to make sure that I publish and collaborate with someone that weren't my initial 2 supervisors, because that also looks bad, because that means that I am that means that my supervisors are carrying me. I'm not a good academic. I'm just, rolling off their work.
Oh yeah, gotta have that single authored paper.
Yeah, apparently I need to, at the ripe age of, I'm currently 24, apparently I need to be a single author, because otherwise I'm not worth shit. And also we're just on another tangent slagging off academia again, but I'm sure industry will have a type of equivalent. It's just we won't know, because we haven't been in industry.
No, I think that's fair. And you said that you don't think you're a hybrid, but I would argue that the fact that you are actively communicating and disseminating, your opinion and knowledge and expertise outside of academic circles is already qualifies you as being more of a hybrid than the majority of professors, sitting in their ivory towers.
I don't like ivory towers. I need a lot of space.
Yes, exactly. I like corners. I don't want a tower. Anyway, but yeah, I think all of this feeds into this these stereotypes and the sort of the disparaging and the snubbing that Kelly was talking about as a practitioner, that she often feels that from people who are academics. There's a sort of, academics think that they're better than practitioners, is what it comes down to. And I think a lot of that is just, trying to protect your own self-image. Right, you've been told all your academic life that it's going to take you 6 years, 8 years, 10 years of training and not getting paid and sucking up to people to...
Well, I mean, we should emphasize not getting paid is you should never ever accept something without funding, or at least a form of payment. Don't do anything unfunded. When we mean you don't get paid, or you get paid like shit, I mean, we just mean that the wage for the amount of training that you have is most definitely not competitive when it comes to market rates. Should definitely clarify that.
Absolutely. You're absolutely right. But this idea that we've had to, or not we, but academics have had to suffer and train, and it's going to take 10 years of that lifestyle to get the clout, right? To get the skills and the knowledge and the training to perform, academic research in the best form. And so it's almost like cognitive dissonance. It's like, well, how can that be true? But also there are people who are practitioners who are also excellent at applying insights and designing research questions and getting funding. And how can they be doing research as well as me? Like, that doesn't make sense. You know, they haven't had to go through what I've had to go through.
You know what this sounds like, getting into academia? You know what it sounds like? A really long-term hardcore hazing plan. It sounds like hazing.
The same thing. Yeah. And I think there is a little bit of that in academia. Sort of like if you've... The power dynamics are extremely salient, and you know you're going to come across academics who you meet and you're like, how on earth has this person got the success that they've had, because they're just horrible to everyone, you know?
I mean, not just that, some of them are straight up fucking stupid.
Yeah, and you just think,
I've had a teacher in the master's course that I had, who I think had left Warwick as soon as I entered the PhD, or at least, you know, somewhere in my first year. And I was genuinely like, how did you finish a PhD? How did you ever get a job here? Like, you're too stupid to find your own backside. Like, no, I mean, sorry, but you know, language. Need to watch my language.
Oh man, this poor person.
They're not nice. They were really, really arrogant, and they were actually really, really dumb.
Yeah, and I think it's something that is quite surprising that, you know, when you enter academia, or you know, all your life being at university, you know, you've been taught by these people who you've just assumed are the smartest people. It's sort of like when you're growing up and you think your parents know everything, and then a couple of years later, 10, 15 years later, you realize, oh gosh, my parents had no idea what they were doing, and they were just improvising. And just, you know, it wasn't very hard to convince me as a child that you know more than me, because I don't know anything. You know, it's that. I feel like
this is exactly how I'm going to approach academia. I'm gonna imposter bluff my way through. Just be like, I am a great academic, and they're like, do you have any credentials? And I'm like, I don't think I need them. Why are you asking me these questions? Fail upwards. I mean, this would work better if I was a man. You know,
well, yeah,
we've gone on quite a tangent. I love how after, you know, if we still have this podcast, once both of us end up, you know, by some chance in industry, that we're just gonna bitch about industry.
Yeah, the tables might turn, but for now we can only bitch about what we know,
which is the academic lifestyle. Well, anyway, we're gonna wrap this up. There was a lot of bitching here. Thankfully, there was also a lot of wisdom from Kelly Peters, the CEO of BEWorks. Again, Kelly, thanks a lot for sitting down with us, and we hope to talk to you again soon, because it was a really, really interesting chat. And I suppose that is it for today.
Yeah. Get in touch on social media if you yourself are a hybrid, or maybe you are in industry and you've experienced a lot of this academic snobbery. Let us know. We'd love to hear from you. Share all of your stories. We're here. We can all bitch. We can all let it out together. It's very healthy. I feel better. You'll feel better. And there we go. But yeah, thank you very much, guys, for tuning in. We hope you'll join us next time with whatever we decide to question.
Exactly. See ya.
Bye.
All your projects always be denying. You're the one I love. You're the one I wanna